My sister walked into my mother's Potomac estate, clutching 3 designer shopping bags, her face glowing with satisfaction. When I asked where my 6-year-old daughter was, she simply admired her fresh manicure and smirked. Oops, I left her at Target. What she did not know was that my silence was not shock, it was calculation. Within 24 hours, that smirk would cost her everything she owned. Before I tell you how I dismantled my family's empire without raising my voice, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you know the dangerous power of a woman who refuses to break. I am Kendra, 35 years old, and a forensic accountant who spent her entire life managing everyone else's disasters. For years, I played the role of the strong black woman, absorbing the toxic dynamics of my family just to keep the peace. But peace ended today. The heavy mahogany doors of my mother's extravagant Maryland home swung open with a solid thud that echoed across the marble foyer. I was sitting at the kitchen island with my laptop open reviewing tax documents, enjoying what was supposed to be a quiet Saturday afternoon. Jasmine, my younger sister, marched into the house. The clicking of her expensive stilettos against the polished stone was sharp and rhythmic. She was laden with bags from high-end boutiques, struggling slightly to balance them on her arms. I looked up from my screen, my eyes immediately drifting to the space behind her. The space that was completely empty. I waited a second, expecting my 6-year-old daughter Zuri to skip through the door, trailing behind her aunt. Zuri had been practically buzzing with excitement when Jasmine offered to take her out to buy a gift for her upcoming first-grade graduation. But the heavy doors slowly swung shut, clicking securely into place. There was no child. There was no chatter. There was only Jasmine dropping her luxury purchases onto the foyer bench with a dramatic sigh of relief. My heart performed a strange, painful flutter, but I forced my voice to remain perfectly level. "Where is Zuri?" Jasmine did not even look at me. She was too busy inspecting a tiny scuff on her newly polished thumbnail. She tilted her head, let out a breath of mild annoyance, and looked up with an expression so devoid of human empathy, it made the blood freeze in my veins. "Oops, I left her at Target." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. She said it with the same casual indifference one might use when forgetting to buy milk at the grocery store. I stared at her, my hand slowly lifting away from the keyboard of my laptop. I waited for the punchline. I waited for her to laugh and open the door to reveal my daughter hiding on the porch. But Jasmine just shifted her weight and began adjusting her designer sunglasses. She was whining. Jasmine continued waving her hand dismissively as if swatting away a fly. We were in the middle of the store and she kept crying about wanting to look at the educational toys. I told her I needed to check out a limited edition shoe drop in the women's department. She would not stop complaining, Kendra. It was exhausting. So I just walked away to look at the shoes. I figured she would follow me or a security guard would find her or something. Honestly, she needs to learn how to behave in public. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to cross the distance between us and physically shake the reality of her actions into her. My 6-year-old child, left alone in a massive retail store, abandoned in the middle of an aisle simply because her presence was mildly inconvenient to a grown woman wanting to look at shoes. But I did not scream. I did not leap across the counter. Growing up in my family had trained me to suppress emotional reactions because displaying any vulnerability was an invitation for ridicule. As a forensic accountant, my daily life involved untangling messes made by greedy, irresponsible people. My brain bypassed panic and instantly locked into a state of hyper-focused calculation. I was assessing a liability, and my sister had just become the biggest liability of my life. Before I could form a response, the soft rustle of silk announced the arrival of our mother. Patricia glided into the foyer from the sunroom holding a half-empty mimosa glass. Her hair was perfectly styled, her jewelry catching the afternoon light. She was the picture of Potomac elite, a woman who cared more about country club politics than the emotional well-being of her own children. She had heard the entire exchange. Instead of dropping her glass in horror, instead of demanding to know how her youngest daughter could commit such an atrocious act of child endangerment, Patricia threw her head back and laughed. It was a crisp, clear sound of genuine amusement. Good, my mother said, taking a delicate sip of her drink. That child was getting way too much attention anyway. Winston needs to stop spoiling her. It will build some character for her to wait around a bit. The pieces clicked together in my mind with terrifying clarity. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of absent-mindedness from a self-absorbed aunt. This was a deliberate, calculated punishment. It was revenge for last night's family dinner. Grandpa Winston is the patriarch of our family. He is a man who built a massive logistics empire from nothing in the early 70s, fighting through endless barriers to create generational wealth. He demands excellence, integrity, and hard work. Patricia and Jasmine have always faked those qualities, coasting entirely on his money, while pretending to be successful businesswomen. Last night, at a formal family gathering, Grandpa Winston had sat Zuri on his lap. He had listened to her read a book out loud, praised her intelligence, and handed her a generous savings bond for her graduation. He had explicitly called her the smartest girl in the room. In doing so, he completely ignored Jasmine bragging about her new luxury vehicle and Patricia boasting about her social standing. The jealousy had fermented overnight. In this house, attention was currency, and my daughter had unintentionally bankrupted them in front of the one man who controlled the purse strings. So Jasmine took my child out today under the guise of buying a gift and deliberately abandoned her in a massive public space to teach me a lesson, to teach a 6-year-old child a lesson, to remind me that they were in control. Patricia smiled at me, a sickeningly sweet expression that she used to mask her cruelty. Do not look so dramatic, Kendra. Go pick up your daughter. I am sure she is sitting in some manager's office eating candy. Next time, teach her not to throw tantrums when adults are busy. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to cry, to panic, to fulfill the stereotype of the hysterical, reactive woman, so they could call me crazy and unstable. They fed on my distress. It was the dynamic they had forced me into since childhood. The responsible, overworked sister who cleans up the messes, constantly stressed and unappreciated. I looked at my mother's smug face. I looked at my sister, who was already pulling a pair of expensive shoes out of a shopping bag, completely unbothered by the fact that she had committed a crime. I did not give them a single word. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the tracking application linked to the smartwatch Zuri wore on her wrist. The screen loaded, and a steady green dot appeared on the map. She was stationary. She was exactly where Jasmine had left her. Without breaking eye contact with my mother, I reached across the marble island and picked up my car keys. My face was completely blank. I felt no fear, only a cold, dark certainty about what I was going to do next. I turned my back on them. The sound of my flat shoes was quiet and purposeful against the stone floor. I walked toward the front door, wrapped my hand around the heavy brass handle, and pulled it open. "Oh, look at her storming off," Patricia laughed, the sound mingling with the clinking of ice in her glass. "Always so hostile. Make sure you tell Winston you lost track of your own kid today." I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun and closed the heavy door behind me, sealing their laughter inside the house. I walked to my car, got in, and started the engine. The drive to the store would take 12 minutes. 12 minutes to retrieve the most precious thing in my life. And after that, I would dedicate every waking second to ensuring that those two women would never have a comfortable day in their lives again. The time for being the strong, silent peacekeeper was over. It was time to go to work. The drive down Rockville Pike took exactly 11 minutes and 40 seconds. I did not speed. I did not run any red lights or weave erratically through traffic. Panic is a luxury afforded to people who know someone else will clean up their mess. I did not have that luxury. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel at 10 and 2, my breathing shallow but strictly regulated. I let the silence of the car envelop me, using the quiet to mentally compartmentalize the sheer terror of knowing my 6-year-old daughter was sitting alone in a massive commercial building. I shoved the image of Zuri wandering the aisles into a locked mental box. In its place, I pulled forward the sharp clinical mindset that made me exceptional at my job. I was no longer just a mother rushing to her child. I was an auditor gathering the initial variables of a crime scene. I pulled into the sprawling retail parking lot, sliding my car into a spot near the main entrance. The automatic doors slid open, hitting me with a blast of aggressively cheerful air conditioning and the bright, sterile fluorescent lighting typical of big box stores. Shoppers pushed carts overflowing with bulk paper towels and seasonal decor, completely oblivious to the domestic violence that had just occurred in their periphery. I bypassed the checkout lanes and walked directly to the customer service counter. A young employee in a red vest offered a customer service smile, but it died the second she made eye contact with me. "I am looking for my daughter," I said. My voice was pitched low, smooth, and completely devoid of hysteria. Her name is Zuri. She is 6 years old, wearing a yellow sundress and a pink smartwatch. She was abandoned in this store approximately 40 minutes ago by the adult entrusted with her care. The young woman blinked, her mouth falling open slightly. Before she could stumble through a protocol response, a voice called out from a radio clipped to her shoulder. I did not wait for her to figure out what to do. I demanded the manager on duty. The employee quickly picked up a phone, dialing a short extension, her voice trembling as she whispered into the receiver. Within 60 seconds, a man in a short-sleeved button-down shirt hurried toward the counter, followed closely by a uniformed security guard. He introduced himself as the store manager. He started to offer corporate platitudes about safety protocols, but I cut through his script. I told him my daughter's exact location based on the GPS coordinates actively pinging to my phone. The security guard nodded, confirming they had a little girl matching that description in the back office. They led me down a long, windowless cinder block hallway that felt entirely disconnected from the bright retail space out front. The manager opened a heavy gray door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The breath I had been holding for the last 20 minutes finally left my lungs. Zuri was sitting in an oversized black office chair that swallowed her small frame. Her legs dangled inches above the floor. Her face was streaked with dried tears, and her tiny fingers were wrapped in a death grip around the hand of a female security officer who was softly reading a picture book to her. Zuri looked up. Her eyes went wide, filling with fresh tears, and she launched herself out of the chair. She collided with my legs, wrapping her arms around my thighs with a force that nearly knocked me off balance. I dropped to my knees on the industrial carpet. I wrapped my arms around her, pressing my face into her braids, inhaling the scent of her strawberry shampoo. I held her tight enough to make her feel absolutely secure, but carefully managed my own physical reaction. If she felt me trembling, she would internalize that the danger was still present. I needed to be her anchor. "I have got you, baby," I murmured into her ear, rubbing her back in slow, rhythmic circles. "Mommy is right here. You are completely safe. Nobody is going to leave you ever again." Zuri buried her face in my neck, her small shoulders shaking as she let out a muffled sob. "Auntie Jasmine said I was being bad." She hiccuped, the words tumbling out in a rush of distressed breaths. "She said I was annoying her. I just wanted to look at the reading games, Mommy." I turned around and she was gone. I looked everywhere. I yelled for her. Hearing my child apologize for her own abandonment ignited a localized fire in my chest. The rage I felt was cellular. It was a biological imperative to destroy the entity that had caused my offspring pain. I kissed Zuri's forehead, wiped the tears from her cheeks with my thumbs, and looked her directly in the eyes. "Listen to me, Zuri," I said, my voice projecting absolute certainty. "You did nothing wrong. You are a smart, good, beautiful girl. Auntie Jasmine made a very bad choice. Adults who make bad choices have to face the consequences. But right now, you are safe, and we are going to go home very soon." The female security officer handed me a tissue, her expression a mixture of profound sympathy and underlying anger. She had clearly dealt with lost children before, but knowing the child had been intentionally dumped shifted the dynamic of the room. I stood up, keeping Zuri tucked securely against my side. My maternal relief was fully established. My child was unharmed. Now the professional fury took over. I turned to face the store manager and the security chief. They were offering apologetic smiles, clearly expecting me to thank them profusely, grab my child, and exit the building so they could get back to inventory management. They expected the situation to be over. They were wrong. "I want to thank your team for keeping my daughter safe," I said, addressing the manager. "Your swift response is appreciated. However, we are not leaving this office yet. The manager blinked, adjusting his collar. Ma'am, we are just glad she is okay. We followed our lost child protocol the second a customer found her crying in the home goods section and brought her to a cashier. She was not lost, I corrected him, stepping fully into the space and commanding the room. Lost implies an accident. Lost implies a child wandered away from an attentive guardian. My daughter was deliberately abandoned in a commercial facility by a 32-year-old woman. That is a crime. It is child endangerment. The security chief crossed his arms, his posture stiffening as he recognized the legal implications of my vocabulary. We can call the local police department if you would like to file a formal report, ma'am. We are happy to cooperate with law enforcement. I will handle law enforcement, I replied smoothly, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. Right now, I need you to pull up the security camera feeds for the main concourse and the women's shoe department. The manager shook his head, holding up a hand in a classic corporate defensive gesture. I am sorry, but store policy strictly prohibits us from showing internal security footage to customers. We can only release that video directly to the police with a formal request or a subpoena. I looked at him with the exact same dead-eyed stare I use when corporate executives try to hide offshore accounts during an audit. I was not asking for a favor. I was establishing a chain of custody for evidence. I am not a customer complaining about a stolen purse, I stated, stepping closer to his desk. I am a forensic accountant who works closely with federal litigators. I am the legal guardian of a minor who was subjected to criminal endangerment on your property. You have cameras covering every square inch of this building to prevent theft. If you refuse to verify the timeline of my daughter's abandonment right now, I will file an immediate injunction claiming your store is protecting the identity of an individual who endangered a child on your premises. I will name you personally in the civil suit for obstructing a real-time investigation. The manager swallowed hard, his corporate training colliding violently with the reality of a mother willing to burn his store down legally. The security chief looked at me, recognized that I was not bluffing, and gave the manager a subtle nod. The potential public relations nightmare of refusing a mother the right to see who abandoned her child was far worse than bending a company policy. Okay, the manager conceded, his voice losing all its previous authority. What exactly are we looking for? I pulled out my phone and opened the tracking application. I tapped the screen, pulling up the precise data log. At exactly 1:14 in the afternoon, my daughter's GPS monitor indicated she stopped moving in aisle 4 of the shoe department, I said, reciting the data with surgical precision. Pull up the camera facing that aisle. I want to see exactly what happened at 1:14. The security chief turned to his massive bank of monitors. He dragged his mouse across the screen, selecting a camera feed labeled South Concourse Shoes. The screen expanded, showing a high-definition view of the aisles. He typed the time code into the playback feature. The digital numbers on the bottom of the screen rolled backward until they hit 1:13 and 50 seconds. Play it, I commanded. The screen flickered as the digital playback began. I watched the monitor with the detached precision of an auditor examining a fraudulent ledger. The timestamp read 1:13 and 50 seconds. There was my sister, dressed in a silk blouse and carrying a designer handbag, walking down the main concourse. Zuri was right beside her, her small hand clutching Jasmine's fingers. I watched closely. I did not blink. I needed to see exactly how the liability was executed. Zuri tugged gently on Jasmine's arm, pointing her free hand toward the children's department visible in the background. She was clearly asking to look at the educational toys, just as she had told me. Jasmine stopped walking. The timestamp ticked to 1:14. Jasmine looked down at my 6-year-old daughter. There was no distraction. There was no sudden commotion or a moment of absent-minded negligence. Jasmine was looking directly into Zuri's eyes. I pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up to the monitor, hitting the red record button. I needed an unbroken chain of evidence. On the screen, Jasmine did not just let go of Zuri's hand. I watched as my sister used her free hand to physically pry my daughter's small fingers off her own. It was a deliberate, forceful motion. Once Zuri's hand was detached, Jasmine took a step back. She pointed a manicured finger at the floor, clearly issuing a command to stay put. Then she turned her back completely. Jasmine walked away. She walked with purpose, her designer heels carrying her straight toward the automatic exit doors in the distance. I watched the entire sequence through the lens of my phone camera. 10 seconds passed. 20 seconds. Jasmine never broke her stride. She never glanced over her shoulder. She never hesitated. She simply exited the frame, abandoning a child in a massive commercial facility without a second thought. The camera remained fixed on aisle 4. Zuri stood completely still, frozen in the center of the walkway. Shoppers pushed their carts past her, oblivious to the panic setting in. At 1:15, Zuri's shoulders began to heave. She raised her small hands to her face, crying alone under the fluorescent lights, until a passing customer finally stopped to ask her where her mother was. I lowered my phone and tapped the screen to save the recording. The digital file was safely encrypted and backed up to my cloud storage instantly. The security monitoring room was dead silent. The security chief stared at the monitor, his jaw tight, his professional detachment entirely shattered. The store manager looked physically ill. The reality of what they had just witnessed completely vaporized their previous corporate defensiveness. They knew they had just watched a felony unfold on their property. "That is premeditated child abandonment," I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. It was not a question. It was a legal classification. The manager swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. We will immediately lock this footage down. We will export a high-definition copy to a secure drive for the police." I extended my hand, keeping my palm open and steady. "I need your business card. Right now. I need your direct office line and your corporate email address. When the authorities contact you, they will ask for you by name. You will ensure this footage is not overwritten, deleted, or misplaced." The manager scrambled to his desk, pulling a crisp white card from a holder and placing it into my hand. "You have my word," he said nervously. "It will be secured in the safe until law enforcement arrives." I slipped the card into my pocket, turned away from the monitors, and looked down at Zuri. She was still holding the female security officer's hand, looking up at me with tired, puffy eyes. I knelt down, picked her up, and settled her onto my hip. Her arms wrapped securely around my neck. I thanked the female officer for her kindness, bypassed the manager completely, and walked out of the security office. We exited the store and walked into the parking lot. The intense Maryland humidity hit us, but I barely felt the heat. I strapped Zuri into her car seat, double-checking the harness tension, and handed her a bottle of water from the center console. I kissed her forehead one more time, shut the door, and got into the driver's seat. I put the car in drive and pulled out onto the highway. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt provided a steady backdrop as my mind began to synthesize the data. Zuri fell asleep within 5 minutes, exhausted by the adrenaline crash of her ordeal. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, ensuring she was resting comfortably before allowing my thoughts to fully shift from rescue to retaliation. The physical crime had been committed today, but the motive had been building for decades. My family operated on a strict hierarchy defined entirely by Grandpa Winston. Winston was a titan. He built a logistics and shipping empire from absolute nothing in the early 1970s. As a black man navigating an industry designed to keep him out, he achieved excellence through relentless grind blood and an uncompromising demand for integrity. He despised laziness. He abhorred entitlement. He expected the people in his bloodline to possess the same ironclad work ethic that built the family fortune. Patricia and Jasmine possessed none of those traits. They were parasites wrapped in designer labels. For my entire life, I watched my mother and sister fake their excellence. Patricia swindled her way into managing the family trust by playing the role of the devout, responsible Christian matriarch. She used her position at the church and her country club memberships to project an image of pristine success, all while coasting entirely on Winston's money. Jasmine was simply a younger, more entitled clone of Patricia. She paraded around town claiming to be an entrepreneur, using her trust fund allowance to buy luxury cars and designer bags, contributing absolutely nothing of value to society. They survived by wearing masks of competence. But Grandpa Winston was getting older and his patience for their superficial lifestyle was wearing thin. He had been asking sharp questions lately. He had been demanding audits of the trust. The ground beneath Patricia and Jasmine's feet was becoming unstable, making them dangerous and incredibly insecure. Last night at the family dinner, the fracture in their facade had become impossible to hide. Grandpa Winston had spent the entire evening talking to Zuri. He marveled at her reading level, praised her curiosity, and publicly declared her the smartest girl in the room. He handed her a savings bond, completely ignoring Jasmine's attempts to brag about her newest luxury purchase. Winston had looked at Zuri and seen genuine substance. He looked at Patricia and Jasmine and saw exactly what they were: empty shells. That was the unforgivable sin. My 6-year-old daughter had effortlessly commanded the respect and attention of the only man who controlled the family purse strings. Patricia and Jasmine could not punish Winston, so they decided to punish the child. They wanted to prove that Zuri was a burden, that she was annoying, that she was just a misbehaving kid who needed to be put in her place. Today, the fake mask did not just slip. Jasmine ripped it off and threw it on the floor of a retail store. They thought leaving my child in aisle 4 would break my spirit and teach me to stay in my lane. They expected me to collect my daughter cry in my car and silently absorb the abuse just like I had done my entire life. They made a catastrophic miscalculation. I merged onto the interstate, heading straight back toward Potomac. I was not going home. I was returning to the scene of the betrayal. I needed to collect Zuri's overnight bags from the guest room, but more importantly, I needed to look them in the eyes one last time before I burned their kingdom to the ground. I gripped the steering wheel, the digital copy of the security footage burning a hole in my pocket. The audit was officially open. I pulled my car through the towering wrought iron gates of my mother's estate. The circular driveway was already packed with luxury vehicles. Gleaming Mercedes sedans, Range Rovers, and pristine Lexus SUVs were parked shoulder to shoulder across the manicured cobblestones. I put my car in park boxing in a silver Porsche without a second thought. I turned off the engine and unbuckled my seatbelt. I turned to look at Zuri in the back seat. She was quiet, her small hands resting on her lap, the trauma of the afternoon still lingering in her dark eyes. I told her we were only going inside for 3 minutes to get her overnight bag, and that she would not leave my side for a single second. We walked up the sweeping front steps. The heavy mahogany doors were propped wide open to accommodate the catering staff. My mother was hosting her monthly post-church brunch. It was a staple of her social calendar, a lavish display of wealth, designed specifically to secure her status among the Potomac elite. I stepped over the threshold, and the sensory overload was immediate. The grand foyer and the adjoining formal living room were packed with my mother's country club friends and church board members. Women in elaborate Sunday hats and tailored dresses mingled with men in sharp 3-piece suits. The air was thick with the smell of expensive perfume, catered shrimp and grits roasted lamb, and the sharp tang of citrus from the bottomless mimosa bar. A string quartet played softly in the corner of the sunroom. It was a masterclass in superficial perfection. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was projecting the image of the flawless, blessed, wealthy family. I held Zuri's hand in a vice grip and walked straight through the crowd. A few guests nodded in my direction, offering polite, vacant smiles. They saw the responsible older daughter, the quiet one who handled the logistics. They had no idea they were standing in a house governed by monsters. I kept my eyes locked on the hallway leading to the guest suites. Then a voice cut through the ambient jazz music. "Well, look who decided to show up." I stopped. Standing by the towering floral arrangement at the center of the buffet table was Jasmine. She had changed out of her shopping clothes and was now wearing a floral silk dress that probably cost more than a mortgage payment. She held a small porcelain plate balancing a single crab cake, a silver fork resting between her manicured fingers. She took a delicate bite, chewed slowly, and looked down at Zuri with a spectacular lack of interest. "Did you find her?" Jasmine asked, her tone conversational, as if she were inquiring about a misplaced set of car keys. "I told you she probably just wandered off to the toy aisle. You always overreact to everything, Kendra. It is honestly exhausting." I looked at my sister. I did not look at her with anger. I analyzed her. I searched her face for a fraction of an ounce of guilt, a micro-expression of remorse, a single biological indicator that she possessed a human conscience. There was nothing. Just the vacant, hollow confidence of a woman who had never faced a consequence in her entire 32 years of life. She genuinely believed her own fabricated reality. She believed that leaving a child in a massive retail store was a perfectly acceptable response to being annoyed. Zuri whimpered, pressing her small body behind my legs, trying to hide from the woman who had abandoned her. I stepped slightly to the side, placing my body entirely between my sister and my child. I opened my mouth to deliver a response that would have shattered her glass house, but the sharp clicking of heels interrupted me. Patricia materialized from the crowd. My mother excused herself from a conversation with Mrs. Jackson, the wife of a prominent local judge, deploying a bright, ringing laugh that was entirely fake. She crossed the room with the terrifying speed of a predator. Her smile remained plastered perfectly on her face for the benefit of the watching guests, but her eyes were pure, unadulterated venom. She reached me in seconds. Her hand shot out and clamped around my upper arm. Her manicured nails dug into my skin through the fabric of my blouse, a vice grip meant to enforce absolute submission. She pulled me a fraction of an inch closer, leaning in so that her face was mere inches from mine. "Do not even think about it," Patricia hissed, her voice a lethal whisper, completely masked by the cheerful jazz music playing a few feet away. "Do not make a scene and embarrass this family in front of the Jacksons. You will not ruin my brunch with your hostile attitude." I looked down at the hand gripping my arm. I looked back up into my mother's eyes. The sheer absurdity of her priorities was staggering. It was a psychological marvel. Her youngest daughter had just committed a felony. Her grandchild had been abandoned in a commercial building, terrified and alone. Yet Patricia's central nervous system was entirely focused on whether the volume of my voice might disrupt the consumption of mimosas and crab cakes. She was not protecting a child. She was protecting the optics of her brunch. I did not pull my arm away. I let her hold it. I wanted to memorize the exact pressure of her grip, the exact shade of her hypocrisy. I evaluated the room around me. I looked at the expensive floral arrangements, the catered food, the string quartet, the designer clothes draped over my mother and sister. My mind, trained to follow money and expose fraud, began to connect the visual evidence in front of me with the financial audits I had been running in secret. I knew exactly whose money was paying for this charade. It certainly was not Patricia's, and it definitely was not Jasmine's. "You left a 6-year-old child alone in a public space," I stated. My voice was pitched low, bypassing emotion completely and landing squarely in the realm of clinical fact. "You did it on purpose, and your biggest concern right now is that the judge's wife might hear about it." Patricia's grip tightened. Her smile stretched so wide it looked painful. "I told you to drop it, Kendra," she whispered through gritted teeth. "Jasmine made a simple mistake. Children wander off. Stop acting like the world is ending and go pack her bags. You are ruining the aesthetic of my afternoon." Jasmine took another bite of her crab cake, entirely unfazed by the tension radiating between our mother and me. "Honestly, Kendra, you need therapy," Jasmine casually chimed in. "You are projecting your own insecurities onto me, just because you cannot control your kid. Connor was just saying this morning how you need to learn to lighten up." The mention of her husband's name was the exact trigger point that shifted the dynamic of the room. I felt a shadow fall over us before he even spoke. Connor, the walking embodiment of unearned confidence, was making his way through the crowd toward us, holding a craft beer and wearing a tailored linen suit, paid for by a trust fund he had zero right to access. The variables of my audit were all gathering in one convenient location. The time for observation was rapidly coming to an end. Connor slid into our tight circle, bringing with him the distinct scent of expensive craft beer and an exhausting aura of unearned authority. He slipped his free arm around Jasmine's waist, pulling her close in a show of performative husbandly support. He looked at me, tilting his head with that specific brand of patronizing sympathy reserved for mediocre men who believe their mere presence resolves all conflict. He wore a tailored cream linen suit that I knew for a fact cost $2,000. I knew this because I had seen the exact bank transfer from my grandfather's trust account to the boutique in Georgetown. Connor was a parasite masquerading as an innovator. His tech startup had crashed and burned 18 months ago, producing zero revenue and an app that never made it out of beta testing. Yet here he stood sipping a microbrew in my mother's foyer, acting like the master of the house. "Hey now, let us take the temperature down a notch," Connor said. His voice was a smooth, practiced drawl, the kind he used to pitch empty business models to gullible investors. "Kids wander, Kendra. It is part of growing up. Jasmine was just trying to give you a break today. No need to look so hostile." There it was, the word hostile. It hung in the air, dripping with cultural and racial implications. It was a calculated tripwire. If I raised my voice, if I showed even a fraction of the rage burning inside my chest, I would immediately become the angry, aggressive black woman disrupting this civilized Sunday brunch. I would be the unreasonable one. Connor, a white man entirely dependent on the wealth of a black family he secretly viewed with condescension, was using my legitimate maternal terror to paint me as an unhinged aggressor. The audacity was not just offensive, it was clinically fascinating. He was standing in a house he did not own, drinking liquor he did not buy, telling me how to parent the child his wife had just intentionally abandoned in a massive retail store. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to explode so he could play the calm, rational mediator to his wealthy in-laws. I looked at Connor's face. I took in the slight sunburn on his nose, the smug certainty resting in his eyes, and the protective way he held my sister, the woman who had pried my daughter's fingers off her own hand and walked away. I refused to take the bait. I refused to participate in his pathetic narrative. Instead of yelling, I turned my attention back to my arm, which was still clamped in my mother's tight grip. I reached over with my free hand. I did not swat her away. I deliberately, methodically peeled Patricia's manicured fingers off my skin one by one. I applied just enough pressure to make her gasp softly and release her hold. I smoothed the fabric of my blouse, adjusted my posture, and looked dead into Connor's eyes. My expression was completely devoid of emotion, a blank wall of absolute disdain. "Your understanding of child development is exactly as successful as your last software venture," Connor, I stated. My voice was incredibly quiet, yet it sliced through the ambient noise of the party like a scalpel, non-existent and entirely funded by someone else. I did not wait to watch the smugness drain from his features. I did not wait for the flush of red to creep up his neck as his deepest insecurity was exposed in front of his wife. I did not wait for Patricia to gasp or for Jasmine to sputter a frantic defense of her husband's fragile ego. The conversation was over. I tightened my hold on Zuri's hand and walked straight past them. I charted a direct path down the long carpeted hallway toward the guest suites, leaving the three of them standing in stunned silence amid the clinking of champagne flutes and the soft hum of the string quartet. The guest room was a monument to Patricia's obsession with aesthetic perfection. It was filled with fragile antiques, cream-colored upholstery, and decorative pillows that were never meant to be used. Zuri's small, brightly colored overnight duffel bag sat on the edge of the pristine mattress, a stark contrast to the sterile environment. I moved with maximum efficiency. I unzipped the bag and began gathering Zuri's belongings. I folded her pajamas with sharp, precise movements. I marched into the adjoining ensuite bathroom, retrieved her toothbrush, her child-sized toothpaste, and her favorite hair ties, tossing them neatly into the side pockets of the duffel. I moved with the precision of an auditor balancing a ledger. Every fold, every zipper, every step was calculated and purposeful. Zuri stood by the door watching me. Her small hands clutched the fabric of her yellow sundress. She sensed the intense shift in my energy, the coiled spring of my focus. I paused. My packing zipped the main compartment of the bag shut and knelt down to her eye level. I needed to ensure she felt completely insulated from the toxicity bleeding through the walls of this house. "We are leaving now, baby," I told her, my voice softening instantly to provide her the warmth I completely withheld from my family. "We are going to go home, and we are not coming back to this house. You do not have to worry about Auntie Jasmine or anyone else here ever again." Zuri nodded solemnly. A profound sense of relief washed over her small face, relaxing the tension in her shoulders. I slung the heavy duffel bag over my own shoulder and took her hand once more. I stood up, feeling the weight of the bag grounding me. The distance from the guest room back through the foyer to the front door was approximately 40 feet. It was 40 feet of hostile territory. I knew Patricia and Jasmine would not let me leave without attempting to assert their dominance. They needed to have the last word. They needed me to submit to their manufactured reality to maintain their fragile psychological ecosystem. They needed me to apologize to restore their balance of power. But the balance of power had already shifted irrevocably. The variables had changed. They just did not know it yet. I stepped out of the guest room, my posture straight, my mind locked onto the financial destruction I was about to rain down upon their entire existence. I walked back toward the foyer, ready to cross the final boundary. I emerged from the hallway and stepped back into the grand foyer, returning to the exact spot where this nightmare had begun. But the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The polite, superficial chatter of the brunch had thinned into a tense, buzzing hum of hushed whispers. The guests were pretending to focus on their mimosas and crab cakes, but every eye in the room was locked on me. The Potomac elite could smell blood in the water. They recognized the sudden drop in barometric pressure that precedes a devastating storm. Standing squarely between me and the heavy mahogany front doors was my mother. Patricia had positioned herself as the ultimate gatekeeper of her own manufactured reality. Jasmine stood directly behind her right shoulder, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, immediately adopting the posture of a victim who had been horribly wronged by an aggressive older sister. Connor hovered near the perimeter of the entryway, clearly waiting for an opportunity to interject more of his patronizing commentary. Patricia's smile was entirely gone now. The mask had completely slipped. Her face was pulled tight, her jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscles working beneath her flawless makeup. She felt her control over me slipping, and the presence of her high society audience made her desperate to enforce compliance. "You are making a spectacle of yourself, Kendra," Patricia hissed. Her voice was a harsh, venomous whisper, calibrated to intimidate me while attempting to keep the volume low enough for plausible deniability among her friends. I stopped walking. I kept a firm grip on Zuri's small hand and let the heavy duffel bag rest securely against my hip. I did not speak. I simply let her dig her own grave. "I am appalled by your behavior," Patricia continued, stepping closer to block my path to the exit. "You march into my home, you insult your sister over a harmless mistake, and you bring this dark, negative energy into a space I curated for celebration. You are ungrateful. I have given you everything, and this is how you repay me. By ruining the mood of my entire event over absolutely nothing." She pointed a manicured finger toward the floor, demanding my submission. "Put that bag down," she commanded. "You will turn around right now. You will apologize to Jasmine for your hostile outburst, and you will sit down and act like a rational adult. Do not embarrass me in front of these people." I listened to her words carefully. I absorbed the sheer staggering weight of her narcissism. My daughter had been abandoned in a public commercial facility. A stranger could have walked out of that store with my 6-year-old child. Yet my mother was demanding an apology to the perpetrator because my maternal terror was disrupting the aesthetic of her Sunday brunch. I did not drop my bag. I did not raise my voice. I did not give her the explosive reaction she so desperately craved to justify her narrative. Instead, I slid my free right hand into the pocket of my tailored slacks. My thumb found the smooth edge of my smartphone. Without breaking eye contact with my mother, I pressed the exact sequence of side buttons required to activate the voice memo recording feature. A subtle, silent vibration against my thigh confirmed the device was active. It was now capturing every single word spoken in that foyer. I needed a clean, undeniable audio record of her priorities to pair with the security footage. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. I looked past the expensive jewelry, the tailored dress, and the carefully maintained facade of the devout Christian matriarch. I saw the vast empty void where a mother's protective instinct should reside. I let a heavy, suffocating silence stretch between us for 3 full seconds. The whispers in the background faded into absolute nothingness. The string quartet in the sunroom seemed incredibly loud in the sudden vacuum of human voices. Every guest in the living room was holding their breath, waiting to see if the strong, reliable older sister would bow her head and apologize to keep the peace. I took a slow, measured breath and delivered the words with absolute, terrifying clarity. My voice did not shake. It rang out cold and sharp, projecting loud enough to bounce off the marble floors and reach the ears of the judge's wife, the church board members, and every country club gossip in the room. I will never apologize for protecting my child from this family. Patricia recoils as if I had reached out and physically struck her across the face. The collective gasp from the surrounding guests was audible, a sharp intake of breath that rippled through the crowd. Jasmine's arms dropped to her sides, her fake victimhood entirely shattered by the sheer, unyielding force of my refusal to play her game. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, completely unequipped to handle a version of me that did not absorb her abuse. Connor took a distinct step backward, his fake mediator persona evaporating the second he realized he was standing in the blast radius of a dynamic he could not control. I did not wait for a rebuttal. I did not wait for my mother to gather her wits and launch another volley of gaslighting. I stepped forward, forcing Patricia to either physically restrain me or yield the space. She stepped aside. I reached out and grabbed the brass handle of the front door. I pulled it open, letting the warm, humid Maryland air rush into the sterile, air-conditioned foyer. I guided Zuri out onto the front porch, keeping my body between her and the house. I did not look back. I pulled the heavy mahogany door behind me and let it slam shut. The finality of the heavy click echoed across the circular driveway, severing the emotional chains that had bound me to that house for 35 years. We walked to the car in silence. I buckled Zuri into her booster seat, ensuring she was completely secure, and got behind the wheel. I turned the key in the ignition, put the car in drive, and navigated out of the sprawling estate, leaving their luxury cars and their toxic brunch far behind me. The drive back to my own townhouse was quiet. Zuri leaned her head against the window, watching the trees blur past the rhythm of the road, lulling her into a state of calm. I kept my eyes fixed on the highway ahead. There were no tears. There was no screaming. There was only the icy promise of a coming storm. The emotional separation was complete. Now the forensic execution was about to begin. We pulled into the attached garage of my townhouse in Bethesda. The heavy security door closed behind us, sealing us off from the outside world and the toxic circus I had just escaped. Zuri was practically sleepwalking by the time I unbuckled her from her booster seat. The adrenaline crash had hit her hard, leaving her completely drained. I carried her upstairs to her bedroom, walking past the framed photos of just the two of us that lined the hallway. Her room was painted a soft, soothing lavender that she had picked out herself, a stark contrast to the sterile museum-like quality of my mother's guest suites. I helped her change into her favorite pajamas and tucked her weighted blanket carefully around her small shoulders. She did not ask about her aunt or her grandmother. She did not ask why we had left the party so suddenly. She just held onto my hand for a long minute, seeking that final reassurance before her breathing slowed and deepened into a restorative sleep. I sat on the edge of her mattress until I was absolutely certain she was dreaming peacefully. I adjusted the glow of her nightlight, silently pulled her door until it clicked shut, and walked down the hallway. The moment my foot touched the hardwood floor of the main level, the maternal armor retracted. The soft, comforting mother was no longer required. What I needed now was the cold, analytical predator that corporate banks and federal regulators paid top dollar to unleash on fraudsters. I walked into my kitchen. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I preferred the sharp, localized illumination of the under-cabinet fixtures. I filled the reservoir of my coffee maker, placed a heavy ceramic mug on the drip tray, and hit brew. The machine hissed and sputtered, the rich smell of dark roast filling the quiet space. I carried the steaming black coffee to my home office. It was a highly organized room, completely devoid of clutter. A large mahogany desk sat in the center, flanked by two oversized dual monitors. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair, placed the mug on a coaster, and reached for my work laptop. This was a heavily encrypted government-grade machine. I opened the lid. The screen illuminated my face in the dark room. I typed in my complex alphanumeric password and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The system verified my identity and granted me access to my secure servers. It was time to pull the trigger on a weapon my family had no idea I possessed. 3 months ago, Grandpa Winston had called me into his private study at his corporate headquarters in downtown Washington. He looked tired that day. The legendary patriarch, the man who had single-handedly dragged our family into the top 1% through decades of relentless grit, was growing deeply suspicious of his own daughter. He had noticed inconsistencies in the quarterly reports Patricia provided to him. He had noticed the extravagant lifestyle Jasmine and Connor were leading, which mathematically made absolutely no sense given Connor's string of failed business ventures. Winston was many things, but he was not a fool. He knew that if he confronted Patricia directly, she would destroy the evidence, manipulate the narrative, and play the victim, just as she always did. He needed an invisible hand to go through the books. He did not hire an outside accounting firm. He hired me. Winston knew I was a forensic accountant, but more importantly, he knew I possessed the one trait Patricia and Jasmine lacked entirely. I had absolute uncompromising integrity. He sat across from me in his leather armchair, slid a highly secure flash drive across his desk, and handed me the master administrative access credentials to the entire Winston family trust. He officially appointed me as the silent third-party auditor. My mandate from him was incredibly simple: follow the money and find the leak. For 90 days, I had been sitting on absolute unrestricted access to their financial lifelines. Patricia thought she was the undisputed queen of the estate. She genuinely believed she controlled the flow of Grandpa's wealth. She thought she held all the power because I never challenged her at Sunday dinners, and always absorbed her passive-aggressive insults in silence. She mistook my professional discretion for weakness. She thought I was just the boring, overworked single mother who punched numbers on a calculator all day. Patricia and Jasmine had absolutely no idea that for the past 3 months, I could see every single swipe of their credit cards. I could see every wire transfer. I could see every hidden account they tried to bury behind offshore shell companies. I had been taking my time carefully mapping out the architecture of their spending, waiting for the right moment to deliver my final, irrefutable report to Winston. But today, they accelerated the timeline. They made the fatal error of involving my child. They thought leaving Zuri in a retail store would teach me a lesson about knowing my place in the family hierarchy. They thought it would break my spirit. They did not realize they had just handed the executioner a highly personal motive to drop the blade today instead of tomorrow. I took a long sip of the bitter black coffee, feeling the caffeine hit my bloodstream. I set the mug down and cracked my knuckles. The physical crime had been documented and secured on my phone. Now it was time to establish the financial motive. I opened my secure portal and typed in the master credentials Grandpa Winston had given me. The dashboard loaded, instantly displaying the vast, intricate web of the trust. I navigated directly to the ledger assigned to Patricia's management. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not care about country club aesthetics or brunch invitations. Numbers tell the exact story of human greed. It was time to find the exact price tag of their arrogance. I moved my cursor over the master transaction history, ready to tear their fake luxurious reality completely to shreds. The master transaction history loaded, populating my dual monitors with thousands of rows of raw financial data. The sharp blue light of the screens illuminated my face in the dark office. The silence of the house was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of my mouse. Forensic accounting is not just about balancing books. It is about finding the hidden narrative that greedy people try to bury beneath layers of misdirection. I started with the most recent fiscal quarter, bypassing the polished summary reports Patricia handed over at family meetings. I went straight for the granular data, the routing numbers, and the clearinghouse records. Patricia was arrogant, and arrogance breeds sloppiness. She assumed Grandpa Winston would never dig past the surface, and she certainly never expected him to hand the keys to the kingdom to her oldest daughter. She thought she was untouchable. I filtered the outgoing wire transfers from the primary holding account of the Winston Family Trust. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the first glaring anomaly. There was a recurring vendor payment classified under corporate infrastructure development. The payee was listed as Apex Solutions. That was the name of Connor's tech startup. The same startup he constantly bragged about at family dinners, the one that had supposedly secured massive venture capital funding. I pulled the corresponding invoices. They were shockingly amateur. They consisted of flat fees ranging from $40,000 to $50,000 a month, vaguely billed for digital ecosystem optimization and consulting services. Grandpa Winston ran a fleet of freight trucks and regional distribution centers. His empire was built on diesel steel and highly secured logistics contracts. He did not need ecosystem optimization from a man whose only real talent was playing golf and drinking craft beer on a Tuesday afternoon. I dug deeper into the metadata of the submitted invoices. The IP addresses matched my mother's home network in Potomac. Patricia was personally generating fake invoices for her white son-in-law, approving them as the trustee, and funneling Grandpa Winston's capital directly into Connor's empty bank accounts. She was bankrolling the illusion of his success to ensure her country club friends believed her daughter had married a thriving entrepreneur. I traced the routing numbers attached to Apex Solutions. The money did not even stay in a business account. Within 24 hours of each massive wire transfer, clearing the funds were systematically redistributed into a joint personal checking account held by Connor and Jasmine. It was a textbook money laundering operation executed with the finesse of a daytime soap opera. Now I needed to see exactly how they were spending the stolen legacy. I pulled up the transaction history for that joint checking account. The screen filled with a staggering, grotesque display of unearned indulgence. There were consistent massive charges from high-end boutiques in Georgetown, exorbitant bills from five-star resorts in the Caribbean, and thousands of dollars dropped weekly at exclusive day spas and high-society charity galas. My eyes scanned the chronological list of recent transactions until I hit today's date. The numbers aligned with terrifying precision. Just this morning, while Zuri was supposedly being watched, a charge for $8,500 cleared at a luxury retailer. I checked the exact timestamp on the bank authorization. It was 1 hour before the incident at the store. Jasmine had been swiping a debit card funded entirely by embezzled money. The designer shopping bags she had dropped on the marble floor of my mother's foyer, the very items she prioritized over the safety of my 6-year-old daughter, were paid for by Grandpa Winston. I sat back in my leather chair, letting the magnitude of their deception wash over me. Patricia had orchestrated a massive financial bleed. I ran a quick aggregate sum of the diverted funds over the past 12 months. The total came to $420,000. Nearly $500,000 had been stolen from the trust to prop up a failed tech bro and a sister who viewed motherhood as a temporary inconvenience. They felt completely entitled to this money. They believed it was their birthright simply because they shared Winston's last name. They had not worked a single day to earn it. Grandpa Winston had spent decades breaking his back, fighting through systemic racism in the 70s, building generational wealth so his family would never have to struggle. Patricia and Jasmine were treating his lifelong sacrifice like a personal ATM to fund their own vanity. The physical abuse of abandoning Zuri was no longer an isolated incident of horrific parenting. It was now legally and morally tethered to federal fraud and grand larceny. They were not just bad people, they were criminals operating right under the patriarch's nose. I leaned forward, my hands flying across the keyboard. I did not just look at the data, I locked it down. I highlighted the fraudulent rows, exported the raw bank files, downloaded the fake invoices, and captured the cleared wire transfers. I organized every piece of evidence into clearly labeled folders. I mapped the exact flow of cash from the trust account to Patricia's authorization straight into Connor's fake business and finally into Jasmine's retail binges. The math was flawless. The digital trail was undeniable. There was no plausible deniability available to them. There was no convenient excuse Patricia could invent, and there was no way for Connor to charm his way out of the paper trail. I had trapped them in a cage built entirely out of their own greed. I compiled the financial records into a single highly encrypted digital dossier. The tension in my home office was electric, built entirely through the silent language of data and numbers. I had the motive. I had the method. I had the exact dollar amount of their arrogance. Now it was time to construct the final weapon. I needed to merge the indisputable proof of their financial crimes with the visual evidence of their moral bankruptcy. The audit was complete and the executioner's block was fully prepped. I opened a new timeline mapping software on my secondary monitor. Having the raw data was not enough. To truly destroy them, I needed to present the information in a way that left absolutely no room for interpretation, manipulation, or emotional gaslighting. I imported the bank records, the fake invoices from Connor's shell company, and the high-definition security footage I had recorded on my phone. I started mapping the federal violations with methodical precision. Connor had registered his fake tech startup as a limited liability company in Delaware to obscure the ownership structure. He used a registered agent service to keep his name off the public corporate registry. It was a basic amateur move designed to hide the conflict of interest from anyone casually glancing at the trust expenses. However, he was arrogant enough to use his personal IP address to digitally sign the incorporation documents. I pulled the metadata establishing a direct, undeniable link between him and the Shell Corporation. The funds were wired from the trust's primary accounts in Maryland to a commercial bank in Delaware. The money crossed state lines. That specific detail triggered federal wire fraud statutes. Patricia had used an interstate electronic communications network to execute a scheme to defraud her own father. Every single transfer she approved as the trustee was a separate count of federal wire fraud. Furthermore, as the designated fiduciary of the Winston Family Trust, her actions constituted a massive breach of fiduciary duty. The penalties for each count of wire fraud carried up to 20 years in federal prison. Jasmine was not an innocent bystander in this financial conspiracy. The joint checking account records proved she was the primary beneficiary of the laundered money. I pulled the receipts from her luxury shopping binges, cross-referencing them against the incoming wire transfers. She was spending capital she knew was stolen. That made her an active participant in receiving and utilizing embezzled funds. Now came the execution. I needed to forge the chain linking their financial crimes to their moral depravity. I dragged the security video file onto the digital timeline. I aligned the timestamps of the video playback with the bank clearing alerts. The story it told was a masterpiece of absolute sociopathy. I built the chronology minute by minute. At 10 in the morning, Patricia logged into the trust portal from her home office. I verified the IP address. She approved a $40,000 invoice for non-existent digital ecosystem maintenance. At 11:15, the funds cleared into Connor and Jasmine's joint account. At 12:30, Jasmine walked into the luxury boutique at the shopping center. She swiped her debit card for the designer bags. The transaction processed the stolen money, draining the exact funds Patricia had just authorized. At 1:14, holding the designer shopping bags paid for by my grandfather's blood, sweat, and decades of labor. Jasmine pried my daughter's fingers off her hand and abandoned her in aisle 4. The tether was forged in steel. The physical and emotional abuse of my child was now inextricably linked to federal fraud and grand larceny. They did not just abandon Zuri, they abandoned her while actively spending the money they were stealing from the man who loved her most. I sat back in my leather chair and stared at the completed timeline. The sheer scale of their cruelty was breathtaking. Patricia and Jasmine hated the fact that Grandpa Winston favored Zuri. They hated that my daughter possessed the natural intelligence, grace, and authentic charm they spent hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars trying to fake. So they stole his money to fund their fake lives, and they used the opportunity provided by that stolen wealth to discard his favorite great-grandchild like trash. I exported the timeline into a single seamless digital presentation. The screen was divided into two distinct panels. On the left side, the financial ledger scrolled in real time, highlighting the stolen funds clearing the accounts. On the right side, the security video played in high definition. The visual impact was devastating. You could watch the theft occur simultaneously with the child endangerment. There was no way to look away from it. It was cold, undeniable proof. I did not add any emotional commentary to the file. I did not write a long, impassioned letter detailing my maternal grief or my lifelong frustration with their toxic behavior. I drafted a concise one-page executive summary. I listed the total amount embezzled, which came to exactly $420,000. I cited the relevant federal statutes broken by Patricia and Connor. I stated the exact time, location, and nature of the child abandonment committed by Jasmine. I saved the file under a simple, unassuming title, Trust Audit Report and Incident Log. I checked the time on the corner of my computer screen. It was 4 in the morning. The sun would be rising soon. Sunday was upon us. Today was the day Patricia hosted her prestigious post-church luncheon at the country club. It was her favorite day of the month. It was the day she paraded her fake perfect family in front of the entire congregation and the local Potomac elite. She used that luncheon to cement her status as a devoted mother, a loving grandmother, and a pillar of the community. It was the perfect stage for an execution. I closed my laptop and walked back upstairs. I checked on Zuri one more time. She was sleeping soundly, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, completely unaware that her mother had just built a digital guillotine for the people who hurt her. I walked into my own bedroom, but I did not lie down. Sleep was irrelevant. I took a long, hot shower, letting the water wash away the sterile smell of the retail store and the toxic perfume of my mother's foyer. I dressed with deliberate strategic intention. I bypassed my casual weekend clothes and opened my professional wardrobe. I chose a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white silk blouse, and simple pearl earrings. It was the exact outfit I wore when testifying in federal court as an expert witness. I was not dressing as a wounded daughter. I was not dressing as an aggrieved sister. I was dressing as the forensic auditor who was about to deliver a fatal, uncompromising verdict. I walked back down to the kitchen. The coffee in the pot was cold, but I poured a cup anyway and drank it black. I pulled my phone from my pocket and set it on the cool granite counter of the kitchen island. The trap was fully constructed. The evidence was irrefutable. The legal and moral tethering was absolute. All that remained was the delivery. I needed to bring the patriarch into the fold. Grandpa Winston operated his life and his business with the same ruthless efficiency I applied to my spreadsheets. He did not tolerate fools, he despised liars, and he absolutely destroyed thieves. I stared at the dark screen of my phone, waiting for the digital clock to strike an acceptable hour to wake a titan. At exactly 6 in the morning, the digital clock on my kitchen wall flipped over. It was time. I did not just send an email with an attachment. A forensic auditor knows that digital evidence can be intercepted, corrupted, or deleted by a desperate party with enough money to hire a hacker. I needed to ensure this dossier was an inescapable trap. I uploaded the master file to a highly secure partition server I maintain specifically for federal audits. I generated a unique encrypted access link requiring a 2-factor authentication code that only Grandpa Winston possessed. I attached a tracking script to the link. The moment he clicked it, I would receive a ping confirming the exact IP address and device used to open the file. There would be no claims of lost emails, spam folders, or technical difficulties. The digital chain of custody was airtight. Technology can fail. Ink and paper do not. I walked over to my heavy-duty laser printer and loaded high-gloss, legal-size paper. I hit print. The machine hummed to life, spitting out the pages with rapid, methodical efficiency. I printed the bank statements, the highlighted routing numbers, and the fake invoices generated by Connor's shell company. I printed high-resolution time-stamped still frames from the security footage, showing Jasmine actively prying Zuri's fingers off her hand. I gathered the warm sheets of paper, aligned their edges perfectly, and slid them into a thick black leather portfolio. It was a physical manifestation of their destruction, heavy and undeniable. I picked up my phone. I bypassed my contacts list and manually dialed the private number for Grandpa Winston. This line bypassed his executive assistants, his receptionists, and his household staff. It rang directly to the phone sitting on the solid oak desk in his home study. It rang twice. The sound of the connection opening was sharp. Kendra. His voice was gravelly, but instantly alert. Winston did not do casual morning chatter. He respected time too much to waste it on pleasantries. Grandpa. I replied, my voice matching his flat, authoritative tone. The audit is complete. I am sending a secure link to your private server now. I tapped the enter key on my laptop. A second later, my phone vibrated. The tracking script confirmed the email had landed in his inbox. Check your messages, I said. You need to open the file labeled Trust Audit Report and Incident Log. I heard the clicking of a heavy mechanical keyboard on his end of the line. I have it, he stated. Open the video file first, I instructed, my tone remaining entirely clinical. There was no emotional hedging. I did not tell him how angry I was. I did not prime him with tears. It is a security recording from a retail store yesterday afternoon. Once you view the footage, open the financial ledger attached directly below it. The next 4 minutes were governed entirely by silence. I sat at my kitchen island and listened to the ambient background noise of his study through the phone speaker. I heard the faint, muffled audio of the security footage playing on his end. I knew exactly what he was watching. He was watching his pampered, entitled granddaughter abandon his favorite great-grandchild in aisle 4. He was watching the sheer sociopathy of a woman he had funded her entire life. Then I heard the sharp click of his mouse. He had moved on to the ledgers. I listened as he scrolled through the fake invoices from Connor's tech firm and the corresponding bank transfers approved by Patricia. I knew the exact moment his eyes connected the timestamps of the stolen money with the designer bags Jasmine was holding in the video. The math did not lie. It painted a flawless picture of betrayal. When Winston finally spoke, the air in my kitchen seemed to grow colder. His voice did not rise in volume. He did not yell or curse. The fury of a self-made titan is not explosive. It is a terrifying absolute zero. The temperature of his voice dropped an entire octave, radiating pure lethal intent. Where are they right now, Kendra? They are at the country club, I answered immediately, delivering the tactical intelligence without hesitation. Patricia is hosting her post-church luncheon in the main dining room. Jasmine and Connor are with her. The line went quiet for a fraction of a second. The sound of a heavy desk drawer closing echoed through the speaker. Bring Zuri, Winston commanded, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. I will see you there. The line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear. The trap was sprung. The apex predator had been released from his cage. I closed my laptop, picked up the black leather portfolio, and walked upstairs to wake my daughter. I picked out her favorite yellow sundress, the exact one she had been wearing yesterday. We were going to a luncheon, and I wanted Patricia and Jasmine to look directly at the child they tried to discard, while their entire empire burned to ashes around them. The drive to the Oak Ridge Country Club took 20 minutes. I pulled my car up to the valet stand, placed the vehicle in park, and handed the keys to the attendant. I stepped out into the humid afternoon air and unbuckled Zuri from the back seat. She was wearing the exact same yellow sundress she had worn yesterday when her aunt left her to be collected by mall security. I held her right hand securely in my left. Tucked under my right arm was the heavy black leather portfolio containing the financial death warrants for my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law. We walked up the sweeping limestone steps and through the towering glass doors of the club. The central dining room was a sprawling, sunlit space designed specifically for the elite to see and be seen. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting a warm glow over tables covered in crisp white linen. The room was packed with the most influential members of our community. There were local politicians, prominent judges, and the senior board members from our church. This was Patricia's kingdom. This was the stage where she performed her favorite role as the flawless, blessed, wealthy matriarch. I stopped at the edge of the dining room, holding Zuri close to my side. I did not announce my presence. I simply stood by the entrance and located their table. Patricia had secured the prime real estate in the center of the room. She was sitting in a high-backed, upholstered chair, wearing a tailored peach suit and her signature pearls. Jasmine sat to her right wearing oversized designer sunglasses pushed up into her hair, casually picking at a plate of seared scallops. Connor sat across from them, leaning back in his chair with his legs crossed, holding a mimosa and holding court. I remained perfectly still and listened. Their voices carried easily over the soft hum of the surrounding conversations and the gentle playing of a live harpist in the corner. "We are scaling the digital infrastructure next quarter," Connor was saying, projecting his voice loudly enough to ensure the neighboring tables overheard his manufactured success. The initial seed funding gave us massive runway, but the user acquisition metrics are so strong that I am already fielding calls for a Series B round. It is exhausting, honestly, but the market demands disruption. I stared at Connor. I knew exactly where his massive runway came from. I knew the exact routing numbers that moved my grandfather's logistics capital into Connor's personal checking account just 24 hours prior. He was sitting in a room full of black excellence, a white man loudly taking credit for wealth that was systematically embezzled from a black patriarch. Patricia reached across the table and patted Connor's hand affectionately. "Connor is far too modest," my mother declared, beaming with toxic pride. "He works incredibly hard. I always say that the Lord truly blesses those who walk in integrity." Winston and I could not be prouder of the man Jasmine chose to marry. It is so rare to find genuine ambition these days. Jasmine let out a theatrical sigh, swirling the orange juice and champagne in her flute. "I keep telling him he works too much," Jasmine chimed in. "That is why I booked the private villa in Santorini for next month. We need 2 weeks to just disconnect and celebrate the software launch. I was at the boutique yesterday picking up a few things for the trip. The new resort collection is absolutely stunning." There it was. She was casually referencing the exact shopping spree where she pried my 6-year-old daughter's fingers off her hand. She was bragging about the trip she planned to take using the $400,000 they had stolen. I did not interrupt them. I let the poison of their arrogance fill the air. I wanted the surrounding guests to hear every single word of their lies. I wanted the contrast between their pristine public image and their absolute moral bankruptcy to be violently sharp. Then the heavy mahogany doors behind me opened. The shift in the room's atmospheric pressure was immediate. The maitre d' froze mid-sentence. A server carrying a tray of champagne flutes stopped dead in his tracks. The soft, ambient chatter of the dining room began to die off in waves, starting from the entrance and rippling all the way to the back wall. Grandpa Winston stepped into the country club. He was 80 years old, but he carried the imposing, terrifying presence of a man who had broken monopolies and crushed competitors for 5 decades. He wore a tailored charcoal pinstripe suit. He leaned slightly on a silver-tipped walking cane, but his posture was brutally straight. Flanking him on either side were 2 towering corporate litigators dressed in identical dark suits carrying heavy briefcases. Winston did not look at the maitre d'. He did not acknowledge the murmurs of respect from the tables he passed. He walked directly to where I stood with Zuri. He looked down at his great-granddaughter, his expression softening for a fraction of a second before his eyes locked onto the center of the room. His gaze found Patricia. I fell into step right beside him. Together, our small procession moved toward the center table. The silence in the dining room was now absolute. Even the harpist noticed the sudden vacuum of sound and ceased playing. Hundreds of eyes watched the patriarch of the Winston family march toward his daughter. Patricia finally noticed the silence. She turned her head toward the entrance. When she saw Winston, her face immediately lit up with a brilliant practiced smile. She completely missed the fact that I was standing right beside him. She missed the lawyers. She missed the black portfolio in my hand. She only saw her father, the source of her stolen wealth, and her instinct to perform took over. "Daddy." Patricia exclaimed, her voice ringing out across the quiet room. "What a wonderful surprise! We had no idea you were coming to the club today. Waiter, please bring another chair." She stood up, smoothing the front of her peach suit, extending her arms for a welcoming embrace. Jasmine mirrored her mother, putting down her glass and offering a bright, vacuous smile. Connor quickly stood up, adjusting his linen jacket, eager to play the respectful son-in-law. Winston did not stop walking until he was less than 2 feet from the edge of their table. He did not extend his arms. He planted his silver-tipped cane firmly onto the hardwood floor with a sharp, resonant thud. "Do not sit down," Patricia Winston commanded. His voice was not loud, but it carried a lethal, icy resonance that commanded absolute obedience. The smile on my mother's face fractured. Her arms slowly dropped to her sides. Winston turned his head slightly toward the closest server. "Clear the adjacent tables," he instructed. "Tell the guests to move to the patio." The server nodded frantically and began ushering the nearest country club members away from the blast radius. Winston then looked at his two attorneys. "Lock the doors to this section. No one leaves this table." The lawyers moved with military precision, positioning themselves to block any potential exit from the central dining area. It was only then, as the perimeter was secured, that Patricia finally noticed me standing just behind Winston's right shoulder. Her eyes darted from my face down to Zuri, who was clutching my hand tightly. The color instantly drained from my mother's face. The tailored peach suit suddenly looked 3 sizes too big for her. Jasmine let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. She took a step backward, her designer heels stumbling slightly against the leg of her chair. She looked at Zuri, the child she had abandoned in a retail store 24 hours ago, and then looked at the black leather portfolio in my hand. Connor, completely oblivious to the impending execution, maintained his fake, confident smile. "Winston, sir, it is great to see you. We were just talking about the new business metrics." Winston turned his gaze to Connor. The look in the patriarch's eyes was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at the white man standing in a country club funded by black wealth, wearing a suit bought with stolen money, boasting about a company that did not exist. "Sit down, boy," Winston stated, his voice slicing through Connor's manufactured confidence like a scalpel. "You do not speak until I tell you to speak." Connor's mouth snapped shut. He sank back into his chair, his face flushing crimson. Winston extended his hand toward me. I stepped forward, holding Zuri's hand in my left, and placed the heavy black leather portfolio directly into my grandfather's waiting palm. He did not open it immediately. He simply dropped it onto the center of the table, right on top of the floral centerpiece, knocking over a crystal water glass in the process. Water spilled across the pristine white linen, soaking into the fabric, but no one dared to move a muscle to clean it up. "Kendra has concluded her 3-month audit of the family trust," Winston announced to the table. His words hung in the air, a death sentence delivered in plain English. Patricia's knees gave out. She collapsed back into her upholstered chair, her hand flying to her chest. She looked at me, sheer terror replacing every ounce of her former arrogance. "You audited me," Patricia whispered, her voice trembling. Winston ignored her question. He unclasped the portfolio and pulled out the thick stack of high-gloss paper. He selected the first document. It was the bank ledger highlighting the fraudulent wire transfers. He slid it across the table until it stopped directly in front of Connor. "Your company is a shell," Winston said. The absolute certainty in his voice left no room for debate or negotiation. "You have 0 clients. You have 0 revenue. You stole $400,000 from my legacy to fund a lifestyle you are entirely incapable of earning." Connor stared at the paper. His chest began to heave. He looked wildly at Jasmine, then at Patricia, searching for someone to shield him from the consequences of his actions. But there was no protection left. Winston pulled the next document from the portfolio. It was the fake invoice generated from Patricia's home IP address. He dropped it in front of his daughter. "You approved the theft, Patricia. You breached your fiduciary duty. You used the wealth I broke my back to build to launder money for a fraud." Patricia opened her mouth, tears instantly springing to her eyes. "Daddy, please, you do not understand. I was just trying to help them get started. Connor had a cash flow problem and I was going to pay it back. I swear I was going to pay it back." Winston did not blink. "You are a thief," he stated coldly. "But stealing my money is not why my lawyers are standing by the doors. Stealing my money is not why I came down here to humiliate you in front of your friends." Winston reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black iPad. He set it down in the exact center of the table. He tapped the screen, unlocking it, and pressed the play button. The high-definition security footage from the retail store began to play. The bright, clear video showed Jasmine holding Zuri's hand in aisle 4. It showed Jasmine looking down, prying my 6-year-old daughter's fingers off her own and turning her back. It showed my sister walking away, abandoning a child in a public space, carrying designer bags paid for by embezzled funds. The video played in total silence. The undeniable, inescapable truth of their moral bankruptcy was broadcast for the entire table to witness. Patricia stared at the screen, her hand covering her mouth. Connor looked at his wife in sheer horror, realizing that the woman he married had just given the federal government a motive for criminal investigation. Jasmine squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to look at the screen, tears of pure self-pity streaming down her perfectly contoured face. The digital video reached its conclusion. The screen of the iPad faded to black, mirroring the exact future of the 3 people sitting across from me. The silence at the table was suffocating. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, a stark contrast to the absolute devastation radiating from my mother and sister. Grandpa Winston reached out with a steady hand and placed the iPad face down on the wet linen tablecloth. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet rumbling of his tone carried the weight of an absolute, inescapable verdict. Patricia Winston began, his eyes locking onto his daughter with a gaze devoid of any paternal warmth. As of 8 o'clock this morning, my legal team filed the emergency injunctions with the probate court. You are officially and permanently removed as the trustee of the Winston Family Trust. Your access to all accounts, credit lines, and corporate assets has been revoked. You do not have the authority to authorize a single dime. Patricia gasped, her hands flying to her throat. Daddy, please! You cannot do this. My entire life is built on this family. Your life is built on my labor and your lies. Winston cut her off, his voice slicing through her pathetic defense. You are a thief. You stole from my legacy to fund a facade. He turned his head slowly, his piercing gaze landing on my sister. Jasmine had stopped crying. She was staring at Winston in sheer, unadulterated terror. Jasmine, Winston continued, Your inheritance is completely zeroed out. Every provision I made for you in my estate planning has been legally eradicated. The credit cards in your purse are currently declining. The lease on your luxury vehicle will be terminated on Monday. You are cut off. You will never see another cent of my money for as long as you live. Jasmine opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The reality of having to survive on her own merit, a concept entirely foreign to her, struck her like a physical blow. She looked frantically at her husband, expecting the man she had married to step in and defend her. She expected the arrogant tech executive to shield her from the consequences. Connor was sweating profusely. The confident, patronizing smirk he wore just 20 minutes ago had completely vanished. He looked at the 2 corporate litigators standing behind Winston, recognizing the lethal danger of his situation. Winston addressed him last. Connor, my lawyers are currently drafting the formal demand for full restitution. You will return the $400,000 you embezzled through your fraudulent shell company. If that money is not back in the trust accounts within 30 days, I will hand this entire digital dossier over to the federal authorities. You will face charges for wire fraud and grand larceny. You will go to federal prison. The survival instinct of a coward is a remarkable thing to witness. The illusion of their perfect marriage shattered in less than 5 seconds. Connor abruptly pushed his chair back. The wood scraped loudly against the floor. He pointed a trembling finger directly at his wife. I did not know the money was stolen, Connor stammered, his voice cracking in a desperate, high-pitched whine. Jasmine told me it was her early inheritance. Patricia set up the vendor accounts. They told me what to sign. I am a victim here. They manipulated me. Jasmine stared at her husband in absolute horror. The golden child who had spent her entire life believing she was untouchable was suddenly thrown under the bus by the very man she had stolen to support. Connor. How could you say that? Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing across the dining room. You spent that money. You bought a boat with that money. I am filing for divorce, Connor declared, backing away from the table, desperate to distance himself from the sinking ship. I want nothing to do with this family. I am calling my own lawyer. Connor turned and practically sprinted toward the country club exit, abandoning his wife just as callously as she had abandoned my daughter. Jasmine buried her face in her hands and began to sob uncontrollably, the devastating weight of her ruined life finally crashing down upon her. Patricia realized that begging her father was futile. Winston was a fortress of stone. In a final desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of control, she turned her venomous gaze toward me. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wild. She looked at the black leather portfolio in my hand, understanding that I was the architect of her destruction. "How could you do this to your own blood?" Patricia cried out, her voice dripping with toxic victimhood. "I am your mother. She is your sister. You planned this. You destroyed your own family over a harmless mistake. You are a cold, heartless monster." I stood perfectly still. I felt Zuri grip my hand a little tighter. I looked down at my beautiful, intelligent 6-year-old daughter. Then I looked back at the woman who had spent 35 years trying to break my spirit. The generational curse of the strong black woman expected to absorb abuse and fix everyone's mistakes died right there in that dining room. I did not raise my voice. I delivered my final surgical blow with the absolute precision of a forensic auditor closing a fraudulent account. "You stopped being my blood the second you left my daughter alone in aisle 4 to teach me a lesson," I stated clearly. My voice carried across the silent room, ensuring every high society guest heard the exact reason for her downfall. "The lesson has been learned." Patricia flinched, the undeniable truth of my words stripping away her last remaining defense. There was no argument she could make. There was no narrative she could spin. The evidence was absolute. Grandpa Winston adjusted his grip on his silver-tipped cane. He looked at the two litigators. "Serve them the preliminary paperwork," he instructed. Then he turned to me. His stern expression softened into genuine respect. He extended his free hand toward Zuri. "Come along, little one," Winston said gently. "Let us go get some ice cream. We are finished here." I took Zuri's other hand. Together, the three of us turned our backs on Patricia and Jasmine. We walked out of the Oak Ridge Country Club with our heads held high. I did not look back. I did not need to see the tears or hear the frantic bargaining. The execution was complete. The fallout over the next few weeks was swift, brutal, and entirely out of my hands. I simply let the natural consequences of their actions swallow them whole. With her access to the trust revoked, Patricia could not maintain the facade of her opulent lifestyle. The country club formally revoked her membership after the details of the embezzlement and the security footage leaked through the tight-knit Potomac social circle. The church board, unwilling to be associated with a public scandal involving child endangerment and fraud, quietly asked her to step down from all her leadership positions. Stripped of her status and facing mounting legal fees, Patricia was forced to sell the sprawling estate and downsize to a small, unremarkable condo. Connor's cowardly attempt to save himself failed spectacularly. My grandfather's lawyers froze all of his personal and business accounts. Even after filing for divorce and attempting to strike a plea deal by testifying against Patricia, the federal authorities proceeded with their investigation. His reputation in the tech industry was permanently annihilated. Jasmine, completely devoid of any marketable skills or work ethic, faced the harsh reality of independence. With her credit destroyed and her husband gone, she was forced to move into the condo with Patricia. The golden child was reduced to applying for entry-level retail jobs just to survive. I did not feel sorry for them. I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. 1 year later, I sat in Grandpa Winston's corporate office, officially operating as the sole executor of his estate. I had protected his legacy, but more importantly, I had protected my child. When Patricia occasionally left tearful, manipulative voicemails, begging for a relationship with Zuri, claiming that family is everything, I simply listened, deleted the message, and permanently blocked the number. I had taken back my power, not by screaming or fighting, but by refusing to play their toxic game. I let their own greed and cruelty dig their graves. Sometimes the only way to win against a toxic family is to let them destroy themselves with their own actions. Have you ever had to use cold, hard facts to expose a family member's lies? Drop your story in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe for more real-life stories of taking back your power. The heavy brass-handled mahogany doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club private dining room stood between me and the culmination of my entire life's frustration. Inside that room, my mother and sister were comfortably insulated by a bubble of stolen wealth and manufactured prestige. I could hear the faint melodic plucking of a live harpist bleeding through the thick wood, accompanied by the low, polite murmur of the Potomac elite. This was Patricia's cathedral. This was the stage where she performed her favorite role as the flawless, devout, highly successful matriarch of a prominent Black family. She used this specific Sunday luncheon to cement her social standing, surrounded by local politicians, affluent business owners, and the senior board members from our church. I stood in the carpeted hallway just outside those doors. Zuri stood quietly beside me, her small hand wrapped securely in my left. She was wearing the exact same yellow sundress she had worn yesterday when her aunt deliberately abandoned her in aisle 4 of a retail store. Tucked firmly under my right arm was the thick black leather portfolio containing the financial death warrants for my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law. I took a slow, measured breath, completely centering my mind. There was no anxiety in my chest. There was no residual maternal panic. There was only the cold, mechanical precision of an auditor ready to close a fraudulent account. Footsteps approached from behind us. They were heavy, deliberate, and perfectly synchronized. I did not need to turn around to know who had arrived. Grandpa Winston stepped up beside me. Even at 80 years old, the patriarch of our family possessed a physical presence that absorbed all the oxygen in a room. He wore a tailored charcoal pinstripe suit that draped flawlessly over his broad shoulders. He leaned slightly on a silver-tipped walking cane, but his posture was brutally straight. Winston had built a nationwide logistics empire from absolute nothing during the 1970s. He had fought through systemic racism, ruthless corporate competitors, and economic downturns with an iron will and uncompromising integrity. He did not suffer fools, and he absolutely eradicated thieves. Flanking Winston on either side were two towering corporate litigators. They were dressed in identical dark severe suits and carried heavy leather briefcases. These were not family law attorneys hired to mediate a domestic dispute. These were federal compliance lawyers, the kind of apex predators a billionaire unleashes when corporate espionage or grand larceny is uncovered. Winston looked down at Zuri. The hardened, terrifying mask of the corporate titan softened for a fraction of a second. He gave her a small, reassuring nod. Then his eyes lifted and locked onto the mahogany doors. The softness vanished instantly, replaced by a glacial, unyielding fury. He gave a slight gesture with his free hand. One of the attorneys stepped forward and pushed both mahogany doors wide open. The shift in the dining room's atmospheric pressure was immediate and absolute. The maitre d' man, who prided himself on controlling the flow of the room, stepped forward to intercept the unannounced arrivals. He took one look at Winston's face, recognized the sheer magnitude of the power entering his domain, and immediately stepped back, lowering his head in silent submission. I walked into the dining room holding Zuri's hand. Winston walked half a step ahead of me, his silver-tipped cane striking the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, resonant thud. 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 The rhythmic sound cut through the ambient noise of the room like a metronome ticking down to an execution. A server carrying a tray of crystal champagne flutes stopped dead in his tracks, pressing himself against a pillar to clear our path. The soft, polite chatter of the surrounding tables began to die off in waves. It started from the entrance and rippled rapidly toward the back wall. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks were quietly lowered onto porcelain plates. Even the harpist noticed the sudden suffocating vacuum of sound and ceased playing, her hands freezing over the strings. Hundreds of eyes watched our small procession march down the center aisle. They recognized Winston. Everyone in this social stratosphere knew the patriarch who funded Patricia's extravagant lifestyle. But they did not understand why he was marching through a Sunday luncheon flanked by corporate lawyers, accompanied by his oldest daughter and great-granddaughter. The tension in the air was thick, electric, and completely suffocating. I kept my gaze fixed on the center of the room. Patricia had secured the prime real estate, a large circular table positioned specifically so she could be the focal point of the dining room. As we approached, they were completely oblivious to the silence swallowing the room behind them. Connor was leaning back in his upholstered chair, gesturing grandly with a mimosa in his hand. He was in the middle of a loud, boastful monologue, projecting his voice to ensure the neighboring tables overheard his manufactured success. The user acquisition metrics are so strong that I am already fielding calls for a Series B round. Connor declared, his face flushed with the arrogance of a man who believed his own lies. It is exhausting, honestly, but the market demands disruption. You have to strike when the iron is hot. Jasmine sat next to him, wearing oversized designer sunglasses pushed up into her hair, casually picking at a plate of seared scallops. She let out a theatrical sigh, leaning into the role of the exhausted, supportive wife. "I keep telling him he works too much," Jasmine chimed in, swirling her drink. "That is why I booked the private villa in Santorini for next month. We need 2 weeks to just disconnect and celebrate the software launch." I stared at them as we closed the final 15 feet. They were sitting in a room full of black excellence, boasting about a fake tech startup and a European vacation entirely funded by money they had systematically embezzled from the black patriarch walking right toward them. The sheer staggering audacity of their delusion was almost mesmerizing. Patricia sat at the head of the table, facing away from the entrance. She was smiling, soaking in the admiration of the surrounding guests, basking in the illusion of her flawless family. Jasmine was the first to notice the silence. She looked up from her plate, her eyes drifting past Connor's shoulder. The blood drained from her face so rapidly, her flawless makeup suddenly looked like a plastic mask. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She saw Zuri. She saw me. And then she saw the terrifying, imposing figure of her grandfather. Connor stopped talking mid-sentence, noticing his wife's sudden paralysis. He turned around in his chair. The smug, patronizing smirk he wore just yesterday evaporated instantly. He looked at the two corporate litigators standing behind Winston, and the survival instinct of a coward finally kicked in. He shrank back into his seat, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his champagne flute. Patricia, sensing the sudden shift in the energy at her table, finally turned around. When she saw Winston, her survival instinct took a completely different route. Her instinct was to perform. She attempted to immediately control the narrative, to twist reality to fit her aesthetic. She stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored peach suit. She plastered a brilliant, overly sweet smile across her face, completely ignoring the fact that I was standing right beside him. She ignored the lawyers. She ignored Zuri. She only saw the source of her stolen wealth, and she played the part she had perfected over decades. "Daddy," Patricia exclaimed, her voice ringing out artificially loud across the dead quiet dining room. "What a wonderful surprise. We had no idea you were coming to the club today. Waiter, please bring another chair. We would love for you to join us." She extended her arms for a welcoming embrace, stepping forward to project the image of a loving, devoted daughter, thrilled by a spontaneous family visit. Winston did not stop walking until he was less than 2 feet from the edge of her table. He did not extend his arms. He did not return her smile. He planted his cane firmly onto the floor and stared directly into her eyes. The absolute lack of emotion on his face was far more terrifying than any display of rage. "Do not sit down," Patricia Winston commanded. His voice was pitched low, but it carried a lethal, icy resonance that demanded absolute, unquestioning submission. The fake smile on my mother's face fractured. The warm, inviting posture she had assumed stiffened into rigid panic. Her arms slowly dropped to her sides as the reality of the situation finally breached her delusion. Winston turned his head slightly, not looking at his daughter, but addressing the maitre d', who had nervously followed us across the room. "Clear the adjacent tables," Winston instructed. "Tell the guests to move to the patio immediately." The maitre d' nodded frantically and began ushering the nearest country club members away from the blast radius, effectively creating an isolated arena in the center of the room. Winston then turned his attention to his two attorneys. "Lock the doors to this section," he ordered, his voice echoing in the vast, quiet space. No one leaves this table. The lawyers moved with military precision, walking back to the mahogany doors, shutting them firmly, and positioning themselves to block any potential exit. The heavy metallic click of the doors locking sealed the room. The trap was sprung. The execution was ready to begin. I stepped forward, moving until I was flush with the edge of the dining table. I kept Zuri tucked safely against my left side. With my right free hand, I placed the heavy black leather portfolio directly onto the pristine white tablecloth, pushing aside a crystal vase of orchids to make room. I did not open it. I simply slid it across the linen until it rested inches from Grandpa Winston's hands. Winston did not look at my mother. He completely bypassed the woman who had spent decades squandering his resources. His eyes locked onto the weakest link in their fraudulent chain. He looked at Connor. Connor swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously against his stiff collar. The arrogant tech executive who had been loudly boasting about his venture capital funding just 3 minutes ago was now physically shrinking into the upholstery of his chair. He glanced frantically at the 2 corporate litigators standing by the doors, his survival instincts finally alerting him to the massive legal danger he was in. Winston unclasped the portfolio. He pulled out the thick stack of high-gloss paper containing the bank ledgers, the routing numbers, and the fake invoices. He did not hand them over politely. He dropped the entire stack onto the center of the table. The heavy thud rattled the silverware and caused the remaining mimosa glasses to tremble. "Your company is a shell," Winston stated. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that carried absolute terrifying certainty. "You stole $400,000 from my legacy to fund a lifestyle you are entirely incapable of earning." Connor's face drained of all color, shifting to a sickly pale gray. He opened his mouth, but only a pathetic stuttering sound came out. He looked wildly at Jasmine, begging his wife to intervene to deploy some kind of excuse that would shield him from the patriarch's wrath. But Jasmine was paralyzed. She stared at the bank log sitting on the table, her perfectly contoured face frozen in a mask of sheer panic. When her husband found no help in her eyes, Connor turned his desperate gaze to Patricia. Patricia was hyperventilating, taking short, shallow breaths. Her chest heaved beneath her tailored peach suit. "Daddy, please," Patricia whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her impending destruction. "Let me explain. We were just reallocating the funds temporarily. Connor had a cash flow issue and I was going to pay it back. I swear to you on my life, I was going to pay it back." Winston did not even blink. "You are a thief," he replied coldly. "You used your position as a fiduciary to launder my money. But stealing my money is not why my lawyers are blocking the exits. Stealing my money is not why I came down here to humiliate you in front of your friends." Winston reached into the inner breast pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. He withdrew a sleek black iPad and placed it flat on the table right next to the damning financial ledgers. He tapped the screen to wake the device, swiped upward to unlock it, and pressed the play button. He spun the iPad around so the high-definition screen faced Patricia, Jasmine, and Connor directly. The security footage from the retail store began to play. The bright, sterile lighting of aisle 4 illuminated the screen. There was no audio, but the visual evidence required no narration. The absolute silence in the dining room made the viewing experience incredibly intense. The country club staff, who had been pinned to the periphery of the room, stretched their necks, their eyes glued to the digital display of a dynasty collapsing. The video showed Jasmine holding Zuri's hand. It showed Jasmine stopping looking down at my 6-year-old daughter and deliberately prying the child's small fingers off her own. It showed Jasmine turning her back. It showed her walking away with purpose, clutching the designer shopping bags paid for by the exact funds she and her husband had just finished embezzling. Jasmine squeezed her eyes shut. She physically turned her head away from the screen, unable to watch her own sociopathy broadcast in high definition. Tears of pure, unadulterated self-pity began to stream down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She was not crying for the terror she inflicted on my child. She was crying because she had been caught. Connor stared at the iPad in absolute horror. His jaw dropped. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. His wife had not just made a careless mistake. She had committed a felony, and she had done it while actively spending the money he was deeply implicated in stealing. She had handed the federal government the perfect character assassination to accompany a wire fraud indictment. Patricia clamped a hand over her mouth, muffling a sharp sob. The aesthetic perfection she had spent her entire adult life curating was dead. Her friends, her fellow church board members, and the elite society she worshipped would all know that she had raised a monster and facilitated grand larceny to cover it up. The digital video reached its conclusion. Zuri stood frozen on the screen, crying alone under the fluorescent lights. The iPad screen faded to black. Winston rested his hands on the silver head of his walking cane. The time for observation was over. The verdict was ready to be delivered. "Patricia, you are removed as trustee." Winston began, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "As of 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, my legal team will file the emergency injunctions with the probate court. Your access to all accounts, credit lines, and corporate assets is permanently revoked." Patricia let out a guttural, choked wail. "Daddy, no, you cannot leave me with nothing. My reputation will be ruined. Your reputation is already ash," Winston retorted, shutting her down instantly. He shifted his piercing gaze to my sister. "Jasmine, your inheritance is zeroed out. Every provision I made for you in my estate planning has been legally eradicated. The credit cards in your purse will be declined by dinner time. You will never see another cent of my wealth for as long as you live." Jasmine slumped forward, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the reality of having to survive on her own merit finally crushed her. Winston turned his attention back to the failed tech executive. "Connor, my lawyers will be pursuing full restitution for the fraud. You will return the $400,000 you stole through your shell company. If you cannot pay, you will face federal charges. I will personally ensure the prosecutors have every digital footprint you left behind." Connor looked like he was going to vomit. His eyes darted wildly toward the locked doors, trapped in a cage built entirely by his own arrogance and greed. The total destruction of their reality was complete. Patricia looked up from the table. Her eyes were bloodshot, her perfectly styled hair now slightly disheveled. She realized that begging her father was futile. Winston was a fortress of stone, completely impervious to her manipulative tears. Stripped of all her defenses, she turned her venomous gaze toward me. She looked at the black leather portfolio resting on the table, understanding that I was the architect who had drafted the blueprints for her downfall. I had gathered the data. I had pulled the security footage. I had organized the execution. "How could you do this?" Patricia cried out, her voice cracking with toxic victimhood. "I am your mother. She is your sister. How could you do this to your own blood?" I looked down at the woman who had spent 35 years trying to break my spirit, who had demanded I apologize to my abuser just to maintain the aesthetics of her brunch. I felt Zuri grip my hand tightly, grounding me in my purpose. I did not raise my voice. I delivered my final surgical blow with the absolute precision of a forensic auditor closing out a terminated account. "You stopped being my blood the second you left my daughter alone in aisle 4 to teach me a lesson," I stated. My voice cut through her sobs, cold, clear, and uncompromising. "The lesson has been learned." Patricia's mouth opened and closed, but her voice had completely abandoned her. The absolute, unyielding finality of my statement severed the last invisible string she held over my conscience. There was no argument left to make. The grand matriarch of the Potomac elite was reduced to a hyperventilating shell of a woman clutching her pearl necklace as if it could somehow anchor her to a reality that no longer existed. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, but it lasted for exactly 4 seconds. The survival instinct of a coward is a remarkable thing to witness in real time. The illusion of Jasmine and Connor's perfect affluent marriage shattered the moment the financial scaffolding was removed. Connor looked at the thick stack of bank ledgers resting on the tablecloth. He looked at the 2 corporate litigators standing by the mahogany doors. The terrifying reality of federal prison eclipsed any fraudulent vow of loyalty he had ever made to my sister. He realized he was staring down the barrel of a wire fraud indictment, and he desperately needed a human shield. Connor abruptly pushed his chair back. The heavy wood scraped violently against the polished floor. a harsh grating sound that made several country club members jump. He stood up, backing away from the table, physically distancing himself from the women who had funded his entire existence. "I did not know the money was stolen," Connor declared. His voice cracked, rising in pitch, as panic stripped away his practiced smooth tech executive drawl. He pointed a trembling finger directly at his wife. "Jasmine told me it was her early inheritance. Patricia set up all the vendor accounts. They told me what to sign and where to route the deposits. I am a victim here. They manipulated me into this." Jasmine's head snapped up. The tears of self-pity abruptly stopped, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. The golden child who had spent her entire 32 years believing she was the untouchable center of the universe was suddenly thrown directly under the wheels of a moving bus by the man she had stolen to support. "Connor, how could you say that?" Jasmine shrieked. Her voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers, raw and shrill, completely devoid of her usual refined country club aesthetic. "You knew exactly where that money came from. You spent it. You bought a luxury boat with that money. You begged my mother to approve those fake invoices so you could pay off your private debts." "I am filing for divorce today," Connor yelled back, his face flushing crimson as he addressed Grandpa Winston, completely ignoring his wife's hysterical breakdown. "Sir, I will cooperate fully with your legal team. I will turn over every email, every text message, and every bank record showing that Patricia orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme. I want absolutely nothing to do with this family." Jasmine stared at her husband in absolute horror. The betrayal paralyzed her. I watched the scene unfold with the cold, detached satisfaction of an auditor watching a corrupt corporation liquidate its assets. The poetic justice was absolute and flawlessly executed. Jasmine had walked into a retail store yesterday and coldly peeled my 6-year-old daughter's fingers off her hand because Zuri was a temporary inconvenience. Now, less than 24 hours later, her own husband was legally and publicly peeling himself away from her the exact second she became a liability. The loyalty Jasmine had valued so highly, the marriage she had weaponized to make me feel inadequate, was nothing more than a transactional agreement funded by stolen cash. The moment the funds dried up, her husband discarded her with the exact same ruthless indifference she had shown my child. The country club elites, who had been ushered to the periphery of the dining room, watched the spectacle with wide eyes. The prominent judges, the wealthy business owners, and the church board members were witnessing the complete implosion of the family they had idolized. There would be no recovering from this. The rumors would start before we even left the building. Jasmine's reputation as the flawless, wealthy socialite was dead. She was now publicly branded as a thief, an abusive aunt, and a discarded wife. Connor did not wait for Grandpa Winston to respond to his cowardly plea deal. He turned on his heel and practically sprinted toward the side exit, abandoning his wife to face the financial and legal execution entirely on her own. Jasmine slumped forward over the table, burying her face in her arms. She began to sob uncontrollably, the devastating weight of her ruined life finally crashing down upon her. She had nothing left. No money, no husband, no status. She was completely bankrupt in every possible definition of the word. Grandpa Winston adjusted his grip on his silver-tipped walking cane. He looked down at his sobbing granddaughter and his paralyzed daughter one final time. He had seen enough. He gave a sharp nod to his corporate litigators. The two men stepped away from the mahogany doors and pulled them open. The bright ambient light of the main dining room flooded back into our isolated section. Winston extended his free hand toward Zuri. "Come along, little one," he said, his voice instantly softening. "Let us go get some ice cream. We are finished here." I took Zuri's other hand. Together, the three of us turned our backs on Patricia and Jasmine. We walked out of the Oak Ridge Country Club with our heads held high. I did not look back. I did not need to see the tears or hear the frantic, pathetic bargaining that was surely starting behind us. The execution was complete, and the fallout was entirely out of my hands. The subsequent weeks proved that karma is not just a concept, but a highly efficient, naturally occurring force. In the elite, tight-knit circles of Potomac society, gossip travels faster than a wire transfer. By Monday morning, the whispers that started in the country club dining room had exploded into a full-blown scandal. You cannot lock a dozen high society guests in a room, accuse a prominent matriarch of grand larceny, and expect silence. The details of the embezzlement scheme were scandalous enough, but the description of the security video was what truly sealed their fate. The image of Patricia and Jasmine actively endangering a 6-year-old child shattered their carefully curated Christian facade permanently. The church board held an emergency meeting on Tuesday evening. Unwilling to be associated with a public scandal involving federal fraud and child abandonment, the senior pastors requested Patricia step down from all her leadership positions. When she attempted to fight the decision, citing her decades of devotion, they quietly informed her that her continued presence was a liability to the congregation. She was ousted, stripped of the very moral authority she had weaponized against me for 35 years. 2 days later, the Oak Ridge Country Club followed suit. The board of directors formally revoked her membership under a strict morals clause buried deep in their bylaws. She was no longer welcome at the Sunday brunches she had used to assert her dominance. She was a social pariah, entirely cut off from the wealthy network that defined her entire existence. Friends she had known for decades suddenly stopped returning her calls. The invitations to charity galas and society weddings evaporated instantly. The social exile was devastating, but the financial annihilation was absolute. Winston's corporate lawyers moved with terrifying speed. The emergency injunctions were granted by the probate judge without hesitation. Patricia was permanently removed as the trustee of the Winston Family Trust, and all of her associated credit lines were instantly frozen. The bank accounts she had used to fund her lavish lifestyle were locked down pending a full forensic federal review. Meanwhile, Connor made good on his cowardly promise. To save himself from a lengthy federal prison sentence, he signed a cooperation agreement with the authorities. He handed over every email, every text message, and every bank routing slip that proved Patricia was the mastermind behind the fraudulent shell company. Facing a massive federal indictment for wire fraud, Patricia was forced to hire a team of elite criminal defense attorneys. Those lawyers required massive retainers paid entirely in cash. With her access to the family wealth completely severed, Patricia had only one asset left to liquidate. She was forced to put her sprawling Potomac estate on the market. Desperate for immediate liquid capital to keep herself out of a federal penitentiary, she sold the mansion at a massive loss to a corporate developer. The luxury cars were repossessed. The designer wardrobes were quietly sold on consignment websites. Patricia and Jasmine were forced to sign a lease on a small, unremarkable 2-bedroom condo in a chaotic, noisy part of the city. The contrast between the grand mahogany doors of her former estate and the cheap veneer of her new apartment door was the ultimate poetic justice. Patricia spent her days trapped in a cramped living room, surrounded by the few antique furniture pieces that could fit, staring at walls that felt more like a prison cell than a home. Jasmine, completely devoid of any marketable skills, work ethic, or a husband to rely on, faced the brutal reality of surviving on her own merit. The former golden child was reduced to applying for entry-level retail jobs at the local mall just to help pay their utility bills. A woman who had spent her entire adult life scoffing at the working class was now forced to fold clothes and endure the demands of angry customers for minimum wage. I did not lift a single finger to make any of this happen. I did not file a lawsuit against them. I did not call the police. I simply provided the undeniable truth and stepped back. I let the natural, unavoidable consequences of their own boundless greed and cruelty swallow them whole. Exactly 1 year has passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club closed behind me. Today, I am sitting behind a different set of doors. I am seated at the massive, solid oak desk in Grandpa Winston's corporate headquarters in downtown Washington. The view from this top-floor office overlooks the city skyline, a sprawling testament to industry ambition and authentic labor. Following the catastrophic fallout of Patricia and Jasmine's financial crimes, Winston formally restructured his entire corporate empire. He completely rewrote the legal foundation of our family legacy. He appointed me as the sole executor of the Winston Family Trust and the managing director of his primary holding company. I do not just audit the ledgers anymore. I control them. The silence in the executive office is profound, built on a foundation of absolute security and actual earned competence. There is no fake aesthetic to maintain here. There are no pretenses, no lies, and no exhausting performances to keep up appearances for the country club elite. There is just the steady, powerful hum of legitimate business. My focus on the quarterly financial projections is broken by the sharp vibration of my personal cell phone resting on the polished wood surface. I look at the illuminated screen. It is a voicemail notification from an unsaved local number. I tap the screen, select the audio file, and hold the device to my ear. The voice that fills the speaker is shaky, desperate, and dripping with manufactured sorrow. It is Patricia. "Kendra, please do not hang up," she whispers, her voice cracking with forced tears. "It is your mother. I know I made mistakes. I know things got completely out of hand last year. But this tiny apartment is suffocating me. The heating barely works. Jasmine is working double shifts folding clothes at a department store, and we are barely surviving on her minimum wage. I miss you. I miss my beautiful granddaughter. Family is everything, Kendra. You are a strong Christian woman. We have to forgive each other. Please just let me see Zuri. Let us heal this family." I listened to the entire 2-minute message without moving a single muscle in my face. I do not feel a sharp pang of guilt in my chest. I do not feel the familiar crushing weight of familial obligation that used to dictate my every waking decision. I listened to the pathetic bargaining of a woman who happily laughed when my 6-year-old daughter was abandoned in a massive retail store simply because she was jealous of a child receiving positive attention. I listened to a convicted thief who stole hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund a fake tech startup and expected me to smile, stay silent, and clean up the ensuing disaster. When the voicemail concludes, I pull the phone away from my ear. I look at the digital interface. I press delete. The audio file vanishes into the digital ether, permanently erased from existence. I select the caller identification settings, tap the screen one more time, and permanently block the number. There is no dramatic sigh. There are no tears of mourning for the mother I never truly had. There is only the crisp, satisfying finality of a closed door locking forever. For 35 years, I was conditioned to play a very specific, deeply toxic role. Society and my family in particular expected me to embody the trope of the strong black woman. I was supposed to be the tireless mule who absorbed every ounce of verbal abuse, disrespect, and emotional neglect, all in the name of keeping the family together. I was expected to swallow my anger, smile through the blatant disrespect, and use my professional skills to fix the disastrous mistakes made by the golden child. I was taught that my value was intrinsically tied to how much suffering I could silently endure. The strong black woman is a title manipulative people give you to make you feel proud of carrying a burden they have absolutely no intention of helping you lift. They weaponize the concept of strength and the rhetoric of religious forgiveness to ensure you never hold them accountable for their own malicious actions. But I broke that generational curse. I severed it completely. I did not break it by screaming in a foyer or throwing hands in a country club dining room. I broke it by refusing to participate in their manufactured reality. I used the cold, hard, undisputed facts of a forensic audit to dismantle their entire kingdom. I took the undeniable visual evidence of their cruelty and paired it with the exact mathematical sum of their greed. I let their own boundless arrogance and their own criminal negligence dig the exact graves they are currently lying in. I protected my peace by stepping aside and letting the natural consequences of their actions consume their lives entirely. I look up from my laptop and glance toward the oversized leather sofa in the corner of the executive office. Zuri is sitting there swinging her legs, completely engrossed in a colorful chapter book. She looks up, catches my eye, and offers a brilliant, carefree smile. She is entirely safe. She is thriving in school and deeply unconditionally loved. She is surrounded by a great-grandfather who genuinely values her intellect and a mother who will burn the world down to protect her peace. The toxic cycle ends with me. No one will ever make my daughter feel like she is an inconvenience, a burden, or an accessory to be discarded in aisle 4. She will grow up knowing that her worth is absolute. She will understand that true strength is not measured by how much abuse you can silently endure, but by having the profound courage to walk away from anyone who refuses to respect you. The most profound lesson I learned is that true strength is not measured by how much abuse you can silently endure to keep the peace. For generations, society has expected women to carry the heavy burdens of toxic family dynamics without complaint. But breaking a generational curse requires the absolute courage to walk away. You do not owe your loyalty to people who exploit your success and endanger your children. By setting firm boundaries and relying on undisputed facts, you protect your future. The ultimate victory is removing yourself and letting toxic people face the natural consequences of their own choices. Share your own stories of setting boundaries with toxic family members in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more empowering journeys of taking back your power.